Tariffs.
Tariffs have caused revolutions, inspired sheep-smuggling heists, and led to the weirdest trade war over bananas the world has ever seen. But here's the real question. Which tariff was the best, and which was an absolute dumpster fire? Stick around as we dive into some insane tariff stories and crown the best economic move and the biggest facepalm in trade history. Let's roll.
The smelly tariff war over French cheese, 2009.
Cheese. The one thing the French take more seriously than romance and existential crises. In 2009, the US slapped a 300% tariff on Roquefort cheese, one of France's most famous and stinkiest exports. Why? It was retaliation for France banning hormone-treated American beef. The logic: if you won't eat our questionable beef, we'll make your blue cheese ridiculously expensive. The French, being the French, did not take this insult lightly. Some declared it an attack on their culture. Roquefort makers and cheese lovers protested in the streets. French farmers even threatened to storm government buildings, presumably wielding wheels of cheese like shields. Meanwhile, smugglers began sneaking Roquefort into the US like it was an illegal drug. Because honestly, what kind of world forces people to suffer without their fancy moldy cheese? Eventually, the US lifted the tariff, but only after much diplomatic whining, pun intended. Turns out, cheese diplomacy is a real thing.
The chicken tax that changed American trucks forever, 1964 to today.
In the 1960s, Europe got mad at the US for dumping cheap, factory-farmed chicken onto their market. In retaliation, they hit American poultry with massive tariffs. The US, in true "I'll show you" fashion, struck back with a 25% tariff on imported light trucks. And somehow, this chicken tax is still affecting the car industry today. Foreign car makers like Toyota and Volkswagen got creative. They shipped pickup trucks without beds to the US, where workers would slap them on after clearing customs. This technically made them auto parts instead of full trucks, dodging the tax. Meanwhile, American brands like Ford and GM reaped the benefits of less competition. The result: American pickups have dominated the market for decades, while foreign truck makers struggle to compete. All of this because of a tariff about chicken.
The tariff that helped cause the Great Depression, 1930.
Imagine watching your economy crumble and thinking, let's make things worse. That's exactly what the US did in 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods in an attempt to protect American jobs during the Great Depression. Countries around the world responded with their own tariffs, and suddenly, global trade collapsed. Exports and imports both fell by more than 50%, and the Depression got even worse. Unemployment skyrocketed. American farmers who relied on exports lost their biggest markets. It was like setting your house on fire to stay warm in winter. By the time the US government realized their mistake, the damage was done. The Smoot-Hawley tariff is still considered one of the worst economic blunders in history.
The British tea tax that led to a revolution.
The British loved taxing their American colonies because, empire things. But when they slapped the Tea Act of 1773 on the colonies, things boiled over. The act wasn't actually a new tax. It just gave the British East India Company a monopoly on selling tea in America. Colonists saw it as yet another example of Britain screwing them over. In response, a group of men disguised as Native Americans dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. That's the equivalent of nearly 2 million cups of tea. The British government, being just as petty, responded with harsh laws known as the Intolerable Acts, pushing the colonies even closer to full-blown rebellion. Just a few years later, America declared independence, and the rest is history.
The Whiskey Rebellion, America's first tariff revolt, 1791 to 1794.
The US was barely a country when it imposed one of its first major tariffs. on whiskey. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton needed money to pay off war debt, so he taxed distilled spirits, which farmers often made and traded like cash. The response? Armed whiskey-drinking hillbillies in Pennsylvania staged a rebellion. They tarred and feathered tax collectors, torched buildings, and threatened to secede from the country. It got so bad that George Washington personally led an army to put down the revolt. This was the first test of the federal government's ability to enforce its laws, and Washington made it clear: don't mess with Uncle Sam's taxes, even if it's on booze.
The Banana Wars, when tariffs got fruity, 1993 to 2009.
You'd think a trade war over bananas would be ridiculous. And you'd be right. In the 1990s, the European Union gave former Caribbean colonies special access to its banana market, shutting out Latin American producers, many of whom were controlled by U.S. companies like Chiquita and Dole. The U.S. freaked out and filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization, WTO. This triggered a 15-year trade battle over who got to sell bananas to Europe. The U.S. even imposed retaliatory tariffs on unrelated European products, like Scottish cashmere and French handbags, because nothing says banana justice like screwing over luxury fashion. Eventually, both sides reached a deal, but only after years of banana drama.
The Hoppo and the Canton system. Tariffs in Imperial China, 18th century.
In the 18th century, under the Canton system, China restricted foreign trade to the port of Canton, now Guangzhou. The Chinese emperor appointed an official known as the Hoppo to oversee and collect tariffs on all foreign trade. The Hoppo wielded significant power, determining duties and ensuring compliance with imperial regulations. Foreign traders often found themselves at the mercy of the Hoppo's assessments, which could be arbitrary and exorbitant. The system was rife with corruption, as the position of Hoppo was both lucrative and costly to obtain, leading officials to extract as much revenue as possible. This heavy-handed tariff system contributed to tensions between China and Western traders, eventually culminating in conflicts like the Opium Wars, which drastically altered China's trade policies and relations with the world. All right, it's time to declare once and for all, what is the best and worst tariff?
Best tariff. The chicken tax, 1964 to today.
Believe it or not, the chicken tax, a 25% tariff on imported light trucks, ended up being a massive win for American automakers. While it was a petty response to Europe's chicken tariffs, because apparently poultry diplomacy is a thing, it inadvertently protected the U.S. truck market for decades. Brands like Ford and GM flourished, and the pickup truck became an American icon. Sure, it was born out of spite, but economically, it was like scoring a touchdown off a fumbled pass. Not pretty, but hey, it worked.
Worst tariff. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, 1930.
Ah yes, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the economic equivalent of throwing gasoline on a dumpster fire. The U.S. thought raising tariffs on over 20,000 imports would help during the Great Depression. Spoiler alert, it made everything worse. Countries retaliated, global trade tanked, and unemployment skyrocketed. It's like being in a sinking boat and deciding the best fix is to punch more holes. Even economists today use Smoot-Hawley as a cautionary tale of what not to do. Total facepalm.